China's space program is no longer a future problem. It is a present tense problem with rockets attached. This week, a senior Space Force leader said China's development is outpacing expectations and gaining momentum. That matters because space is no longer a prestige hobby for flags and photo ops. It is becoming the scaffolding of military power, economic power, and eventually lunar power too. For a long time, Americans treated China's space rise the way people treat a hairline crack in the ceiling. They noticed it, frowned at it, and carried on eating dinner. That phase is ending. This week, Chief Master Sergeant Ron Lurch said China's buildup has been moving fast and furious, with roughly 1,300 satellites now on orbit and major growth since 2015. He pointed to 2 Chinese constellations already above 100 spacecraft each, with eventual plans for far larger networks. That is the first thing people need to feel. This is not a sleepy, bureaucratic program inching along behind the United States. This is a state-backed machine learning how to put mass into orbit at scale. And scale changes everything. A few satellites can be impressive. A lot of satellites become infrastructure. Infrastructure becomes leverage. Leverage becomes strategy. That is the pattern here. China is not trying to look modern. It is trying to become hard to dislodge. Once a country starts building large constellations, it is no longer thinking in terms of isolated missions. It is thinking in terms of persistence, redundancy, and services that can support military operations, communications, positioning, remote sensing, and whatever else the next crisis demands. The sky stops being a gallery and starts becoming a utility belt. That is what makes this story more serious, the moment you stop counting launches and start asking, what sort of state is coordinating them? The answer is a state that does not really separate commercial from strategic, the way Americans still tend to do. Lerch said the Chinese commercial sector is deeply entangled with the military side, and that the capabilities visible on the commercial end likely imply even better ones for military use. China does not treat its private firms as charming little market actors wandering about in search of quarterly earnings. It treats them as tools inside a larger national effort. There is a reason so much Chinese space activity feels purposeful. Purpose has, in fact, been supplied. The Pentagon's latest China Military Power Report says Beijing is expanding launch capabilities to support military, civil, and commercial goals at once. Beijing understands the future belongs to the country that can replenish orbital networks quickly and cheaply. Not glamorous, but then empires are often built by people who took logistics more seriously than poetry. Once you understand that fusion, the next concern comes into view. A state that wants orbital scale and strategic endurance will eventually want the one thing that makes both dramatically easier: reusable launch. This is where the race starts looking more like industry and less like pageantry. Lurch said the United States still puts more payload on orbit and does it more efficiently, largely because reusable systems support higher launch cadence. He also said China knows this and is heavily pursuing reusable technology. That point matters because reusable launch is the difference between owning a fleet of trucks and throwing each one into a river after a single grocery run. Countries that master reusability can refresh constellations faster, replace losses faster, experiment more often, and scale commercial offerings more aggressively. They can also blur the line between peacetime buildup and wartime regeneration. A nation with cheap, frequent access to orbit has options. A nation without it has PowerPoint. And China appears to understand the stakes perfectly well. Its firms are working toward recovery and reuse. The United States still leads. But the relevant fact is not that China has already caught up. It is that China is walking in the correct direction with a very large checkbook, which means the contest is no longer about who can reach orbit. It is about who can sustain presence, adapt quickly, and carry that advantage farther outward. And farther outward now means cislunar space. Lurk said China already has 3 assets operating there to test communications and navigation infrastructure around the moon. Cislunar space is the next strategic layer above low Earth orbit. Whoever builds early infrastructure there gets influence over routes, communications, awareness, and eventually access to the moon itself. The first roads beyond Earth may not be roads, but the people who place the signs and fuel stations will still matter a great deal. This is where the old American habit of treating lunar activity as vaguely inspirational begins to look expensive. China seems increasingly interested in the moon as infrastructure. The United States still sometimes talks about it like a poster from a science museum gift shop. One side is laying cables in its imagination. The other is still admiring the brochure. If China is scaling satellites, fusing commercial and military sectors, chasing reusability, and reaching towards cislunar infrastructure, what exactly is the United States doing in response? The American answer is becoming clearer. The Space Force says it intends to integrate commercial solutions into hybrid architectures so the joint force keeps an advantage. U.S. Space Command says future military effectiveness in space will depend on deeper partnership with industry. The basic idea is sound. If China is using every tool available, America cannot afford to fight with one hand tied behind its back. The real test is whether the United States can combine commercial dynamism, military clarity, and industrial scale quickly enough to stay ahead. America still has enormous advantages. Those are the bones of leadership. But bones still require muscle, and muscle requires repetition. China is repeating. So that is the story. Satellites, launch, commercial fusion, reusability, cislunar activity. That is not a trend line you ignore unless your retirement plan involves learning Mandarin on the moon. China's space rise matters because orbit is no longer a sideshow to power on Earth. It is part of the machinery of power itself. Communications, surveillance, positioning, logistics, missile warning, navigation, economic services, all of it increasingly depends on what happens above the atmosphere. China is not dabbling, it is building. And it is building with the patience of a state that thinks in decades rather than news cycles. Advantages do not preserve themselves out of sentiment. They have to be exercised, funded, and turned into systems that endure. China appears to know that. America needs to remember it before the bill comes due. Watch the next video, because this is about whether America still knows how to act like a great power when the high ground is 240,000 miles away. This has been Gene Botkin with Ellen Arda. End transmission.